So, welcome to Redirect Immigration Law and Perspectives. I don't even know. We can't even call it semi-regular anymore. It's an immigration law podcast. I'm Stephen.
Irregularly timed.
I'm regular.
Irregular.
In terms
You're
of
regular?
in terms of my bowel movements, right?
Me too. Congratulations.
I'm here with Matthew Archambault, fellow immigration attorney out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I volunteered you for a free consultation today on Twitter.
Yeah, that's nice. I'm just going to ignore that happened, actually. So.
Well, then I saw that they emailed me, so it backfired. I should respond. I don't think you understand my tweet. My tweet was, no, I'm happy to talk to these people. We'll see what we can do for them.
Yeah, so we do this show every once in a while.
And it's hard. We got to get back on it. I have COVID right now.
Yeah.
And my wife is in treatment for breast cancer. So it's been a really
weird. I didn't know you're sharing. Wow.
What's that?
I didn't know you were sharing that. Have you shared? I don't know if we.
I did an episode towards the beginning saying we were taking a break.
Oh, that's true.
But nobody listens to it. So I don't know if people know.
She's doing well, right?
Yeah, she's doing well. Anyways, things are crazy. It's been a crazy year. Hopefully we can get back onto some sort of more regular.
And are you busier? I'm busier, and all my colleagues around here are busier too.
Yeah. It's pretty busy.
I think there was that COVID lull, right? Where kind of court stopped, and now the courts have been open for a while now, but it seems like, you unbent the hose and all the water is rushing out now. So
there's this cool thing that happens to me now where I'll get 3 BIA briefing schedules at a time. And
I think they do that. Everyone, I swear to God, every time I'll complain about it and kind of yeah, it happened. That just happened to me too.
Yeah.
Without fail.
And they're starting to come faster too, I've noticed. So it used to be we'd get one for that was a case that was tried a year and a half, 2 years ago. And now it's oh yeah, that was.
So things are a little, that's why we're not so regular, Joe. And also we're somewhat lazy. So anyway, so today we're going to talk about some cool things, right? There's some marriage fraud stuff I think we should start off with. And in Venezuela, I think the marriage fraud stuff's a little more fun.
Now, you know more about this than I do. I know the fly-by Twitter version, but this seems like a different version of the sort of fake Homeland Security University that they did a few years ago to entrap a bunch of students. Is it along those lines?
Kind of. But let's take a step back, right? So one way to immigrate to the United States, or to get papers, as the kids say today, is to marry a U.S. citizen. And
which I think it's worth mentioning. It's worth mentioning that is not the silver bullet.
Yes.
There's plenty of people who are married to a U.S. citizen who don't qualify for papers. It's not as easy as you think.
But generally, in the immigrant community, it's a question you get all the time. Someone who has no options, they'll say, well, what if I marry a U.S. citizen, right? It is a common knowledge in the immigrant community that marrying a U.S. citizen can often make things easier. And anyone who has spent any time within an immigrant community talking to people knows people that have gained status this way. My wife's Peruvian. She obviously has a lot of Peruvian friends and family, and we've been to a lot of parties with Peruvians and all that. And I certainly have met people who have gained status that way. It's
one of the few sort of immigration law things that permeates into popular culture too. Like there's
the movies
like The Proposal, or I remember there was a show when I was
Green Card. There's the French guy.
Yeah, there was a show when I was growing up as some sort of sitcom about, I think, an Irish guy who needed a green card, so he married, whatever. So people have this understanding.
And so marriage fraud, there are one or two ways it can happen. One is the old financial way. Someone set up, say, hey, we'll pay this person, this U.S. citizen, $10,000, $15,000, whatever the going rate is. You guys will get married, you produce fraudulent documents, and there it is. The immigrant is hoping to get a green card out of that. The other way is a friend's way, where you're close friends or maybe colleagues or friends of relatives, and they're really kind of doing the other person a favor. And it can get complicated. And
We all know that if you're really married to someone,
yeah,
you're not friends. You, you hate each other. That's interesting.
so, but that is a very common thing that close friends will just decide to do someone a favor, or they might even have been in a relationship. I had one couple who they were in a romantic relationship for years. They broke up. It was an amicable breakup. They weren't compatible for a romantic or married life, but the US citizen had a lot of deep feelings for the immigrant and felt sorry for the immigrant's plight, and they decided, hey, let's just get married and go through with it. They actually got through the initial part. They were going for the what they call it, to remove the conditions, the second step that often happens. And that's where the ruse fell apart, because by that time the US citizen didn't like the immigrant anymore, and it had gotten a little contentious, and she kind of spilled the beans. So marriage fraud is when an immigrant marries solely for the purpose of obtaining an immigration benefit. Does it have to be remuneration? But it just has to be for the sole purpose. So sometimes it does get, because people have different motivations, right, for getting married. And sometimes people are getting married so an uninsured person can get insurance, right? They might love and care for each other, but it might come down to timing. Me and my wife married because she had to come to the United States to be with me, because we had met in South Korea. We went to Peru. We got married so she could come so we can continue our relationship. So there was certainly an immigration aspect of it. Those are practicalities of things. Now, immigration takes this really seriously, way probably too serious for any of it. Because from my perspective, who really cares? Honestly, I mean, even these people that are committing marriage fraud, they're still going through the same background checks as everyone else. You know, criminal background check, security background check, all these other things. And I just don't see it. Maybe we should look up statistics on it and all that, but I just don't think it's that big of a deal. I really don't.
Can you talk a little bit about the types of investigations that you've seen, or the types of evidence that we get asked for in like a routine case? I think that might be interesting for people to
right. So,
that.
So lots of marriages that get flagged will be if there's a disparity in age, a disparity in social status, the immigrant being brown and the US citizen being white. Or in Philadelphia, African Americans marrying Africans gets flagged. Or Puerto Ricans marrying anyone in my neck of the woods seems to get flagged. So what they're looking for, like when they do their investigation, like you'll go to the marriage interview with them, you prepare all the documents, and we can be fooled, right? I mean, I've been fooled in the past by couples, right? It can happen, right? And at the time of the interview, everything might seem fine, but there might be a flag. It might be one of these bias flags that they'll never tell you about. Or there might be something, for example, they do a public records check. So you have couple A, immigrant and US citizen, and they do a public records check on US citizen and find out that they have another address, another residency that they haven't revealed. Sometimes they may ask them about it, but sometimes they may not. They may find out that they have energy bills at someplace else. Whatever. They have a lot of access. And this is something we go over with our clients. Like, look, they know a lot more than I do. So you can fool me, but you're unlikely to fool them. Now, sometimes they're very good explanations for it. It happens to be their parents' house. It happens to be an old residence that they lived at. Records haven't been updated. But when you walk out of an interview, most of the time you have a sense that there's something, right? Like, maybe the answers weren't there. You know from the tone of the question and from the officer. So they usually, at that point, they take two routes if they suspect there's marriage fraud. The one route is they don't do anything. They set the file aside and they just let it languish and wait until what they feel the couple gets frustrated and ends up getting divorced and just abandons it. The other is that they might start a fraud investigation where they'll send an officer to a person's residency and look around. And, I've had it happen many times to my clients. And, the reports can be pretty hilarious. I had one, just so you know, like how ridiculous they can be. This couple had gotten divorced by the time they got around to do the fraud interview. They had separated, they got divorced. They went to the US citizen's ex-wife's house and they said, "We need to talk to you about your marriage to immigrant dude." And the first thing she did was she went in a drawer and she pulled out the divorce decree. Now, there's a divorce decree. There's no basis for the marriage petition. So they should have just said, "All right, that's fine. We'll just deny it and move on." But they decided to question her. And the questioning was absolutely ridiculous. They're not very good at it. And they established that they didn't live together. And that was the basis for the marriage fraud finding. Obviously, they had been divorced at that point for like a year. But that's what they do. And they take this really seriously to the point where now we're going to talk about is an indictment out of the Western District of New York in Buffalo, New York. And this was an investigation by Homeland Security's investigation. And so they're not typically worried about friends helping friends. What they're worried about is when there are marriage brokers kind of engage in this large scale.
You mentioned earlier it's rare, and it is. I've never had a marriage fraud finding, and I'm just one guy,
Really?
but it is also true that there are, like you said, brokers, scammers, essentially, who will bring these people together, right? So a US citizen, and they'll arrange for payment, and they sort of know how to game the system. So it is a thing that exists.
Right. And what they did in the Homeland Security investigation thing is I think they had someone that they suspected of this. In this scheme, and this is pretty common, you have a non-lawyer who kind of makes all the arrangements. And then they arrange with an attorney to do all the paperwork. So in here, there was a woman named Delana Shaw. And I don't know exactly where she was, in the Buffalo area. And she was arranging marriages for, it seems, predominantly people from India, immigrants. She was introduced to, I think there were 3 different purportedly Indian immigrants who, actually, I think they all were Indian immigrants, but I'll get to it, who wanted to gain status in the United States. And she set them up with 3 separate US citizens. The catch is that these Indian immigrants were actually work for the Department of Homeland Security. They're actually Department of Homeland Security officers working undercover.
Undercover agents.
Undercover agents. It seems like maybe they were all like Indian immigrants at some point in time, but Department of Homeland Security does have a lot of immigrants that work for it.
Were these employees of HSI, or were these undercover assets?
It seems 1 was an undercover asset and 2 may have been actual DHS employees. So this woman arranged for the agents, we'll just call them agents, to marry the US citizen, an actual real marriage. She put together fraudulent documents, lease agreements, bills, things like that that you would typically when someone gets when you do this, you have to prove that your marriage is true. So you would include things like a lease agreement for an apartment, bills, you know, evidence showing that you guys live together, bank accounts, things like that. So this agent did all this for them, took them through the process, and then they used all this evidence to indict them. But one of the things is that they got a lawyer involved, and they contact this lawyer in the first indictment, the first person who was indicted, and said, "Oh, the payment's going to be." They have an interview like tomorrow or in like a couple days for their marriage interview, and we'd like you to fly into Buffalo and pay you $5,000 to prepare them and do the interview, which isn't like an absurd amount of money. I mean, Stephen, if someone said, you have to be an interview tomorrow at a place that we have to fly you to prepare, review everything and prepare them. I mean, $5,000 would, I mean, it's not like $50,000, right?
Right.
So, and then another one, he prepared everything. He charged him $4,000, and $1,800 of that was for filing fees. So he only took away like $2,200, and the other one was $5,000 to prepare everything, including the interview. Which is kind of an aside, but this lawyer is now getting indicted, and he'll probably get convicted and go to jail and lose his license. But dude's charging way too little, right?
Come on, man. Especially if you're going to be doing felonies.
I mean, $5,000 is what I would generally charge for a marriage case. And I don't have to prepare fraudulent documents for my client,
Yeah,
So
very
that always
cool.
kills me. I'm like, sometimes you see this, like these attorneys committing these frauds, and they're not even like charging a lot. Like, it should have been like $50,000. Like, make it worth his while. But anyways, what is odd about this is they use these special agents to marry these U.S. citizens. Now, we're only reading the government's indictment, so I don't know what the defense is. I mean, from the indictment, it seems like these U.S. citizens were kind of like willing participants in all this. They knew it was all fraudulent and all that. It would be interesting to hear their defense, but I guess I never would believe that they would actually go to this degree. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You mean to like actually marry someone?
Yeah. Because I mean, I have a client who was indicted for marriage fraud. This is well before I represented him. And it was the same thing. A broker arranged the marriage for him. It was a fraudulent marriage. But the person he married was an undercover agent. He was an undercover agent. He was an immigrant. And, they were able to get that conviction. So I don't know why they thought they had to. I mean, they had the scheme identified. It's clear. So why did they have to go to these undercover agents? Like, it would have been easy enough to uncover, I think.
Yeah, right. I don't know. It's so weird. It reminds me of the Muslim entrapment cases and during the war on terror where the FBI would take, like a 18-year-old Muslim kid in New York somewhere who was just trying to like figure out his life. And the FBI would basically, radicalize these people and talk them into like, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea? And in a lot of these cases, the ultimate defendant, the Muslim kid, at first would have all kinds of trepidation. Like, I don't really want to do that. And I don't think I'm not about that. And then eventually they would like talk them into doing something illegal and then arrest them and act like they'd foiled this big terror plot. But in reality, they were the instigators from the very beginning. So what is the theory behind this kind of law enforcement?
Well, what is not clear from the indictment is, did these U.S. citizens, did they seek this out, or were they pursued? And lots of times, people engage in this because they need money. They're on economic hard times. And that's one of the red flags that you'll see, a US citizen who's like very impoverished, who's on like all sorts of government programs, and they enter into one of these marriages. That's one red flag that they'll use. So it is unclear who encountered who. I guess that will come up later on. But generally, when I have seen prosecutions for this, what will happen is the way the government is tipped off is at the marriage interview, stuff doesn't line up. And lots of times they'll take the US citizen and they'll separate them. And they also say to the US citizen, look, we know this is a fraudulent marriage. Do you know that you could go to jail? And, they'll threaten them and all those things. And the US citizen, they are engaged in a fraudulent marriage, may very well say yes. And they'll just get all the information they need from the US citizen. This person paid me $10,000 and I was arranged from them. And that's generally how these things unravel. So why they thought they needed to do it this way is beyond me. But I mean, it just makes you pause. Like, next time you get a consultation, is the immigrant, do they work for ICE? Does a US citizen work for ICE? And have you ever thought that though, when you're doing a consultation, like, is this for real?
I've definitely had, is this for real in my mind during a consultation? Yes. I don't know that I've ever specifically wondered if the potential client is an employee of the Department of Homeland Security. But
I mean, I've had clients or potential clients come straight out and say, well, we could just do a fake marriage.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And then I'm like,
usually how that comes up in my consultations, because my very first question is always, are you married? That's where I start. And then I'll ask.
Is that only for the ladies?
Only ladies, ladies only. It's a flow chart. The first question is, are you a lady? Arrow down, are you married? But no, and then I'll ask some more questions like, are you in a relationship? Are you dating anyone, living with anyone? And just try and suss out their relationship status. And yeah, it's fairly common that people who are totally single at the beginning of the consultation, at the end, will ask, well, what if I get married? And I don't know if they mean like, what if I get married hypothetically one day after I fall in love? Or if it's more like, someone at work seems like they'd be willing.
Yeah.
If I grease the wheels, or whatever. I don't know. I've never had somebody come straight out and say like, I want to do a marriage fraud. You know what I mean?
Oh, I have. So, and, but I advise against it because what I often see is that I will get people who have done the marriage fraud, gotten caught, and haven't been deported, and then come with their real love of their life person that they may have had children with. And if you're found to have committed marriage fraud, then you cannot get any visa ever here in the United States. So this one guy I just mentioned, soon after he entered the United States, he engaged in his fraudulent marriage, got caught, he was sentenced, he got probation stuff and all that. He pled guilty. And, years later, he had never got deported. He was from a country that they weren't deporting people to at that time. And he married a lovely woman. They have 3 really beautiful children together, but he is never going to be able to get status here in the United States. So he paid a really big price.
Right.
For it. And so really the threat of jail and all that is usually not that real, to be honest. That is being foreclosed from any immigration relief in the future is really
that's the big one.
Biggest. But do other countries have this? Do other countries do they go like in Britain, Germany, France, thinking of Western European countries now, Australia, or do they? You can go to Peru, like me. I could get status through my wife in Peru, right? Do they have that big of a concern about that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think like.
Do you think it's a big deal?
Well, if you're going to have a scheme, right?
From not from a legal standpoint, just like a moral standpoint, do you think it's a big deal?
Is this entrapment?
I don't think it's a big
Are
deal. So
you
think about
eyes
what
right
I
now?
like.
Okay, so here's what I would say. Like, you've got to follow the law, right? So in the consultation context that I mentioned earlier, if somebody who's earlier mentioned that they are totally single, they ask the sort of innocuous question, what if I get married? I will explain that could be one way, or in a lot of cases, that's not even enough to fix their problem. But I will explain that could fix it, but it's got to be a legitimate marriage, and here's why, and so on and so forth. So that's my big disclaimer. What I would say is the people who commit marriage fraud, I think that, like, the question of morally, is it a big deal? Well, you know, a lot of times these are people who have very sympathetic circumstances, who are just trying to support themselves and their families. And they see this as, in many cases, literally the only way that they can get status. And so we've got a system that's so constraining on immigrants and makes it so hard for them to get other kind of legal status. The average person committing marriage fraud, if they could go and say, I've had the same job for 2 years, I want an employment adjustment of status based on my, I've paid taxes and I've been a good employee. They would rather do that, and most of them would qualify for something like that if it existed, than go and lie and do this whole thing. And so I'm very sympathetic to people who find themselves backed into that corner. We've talked a lot about the people that we talk to and how almost always their number one concern is like, how can I get a permit to re-enter the country so I can go see my family abroad, right? And so you have to imagine yourself. It's easy to hear like marriage fraud. Would you do it? Well, no, I wouldn't. But imagine like you hadn't seen your parents for 20 years and now they're dying. They have cancer. They're literally on their deathbed. And the only way that you can go see them is by marrying your friend and convincing the government that you're in a bona fide relationship when you're not. Like, suddenly it's not so clear cut, right? And so, in my opinion, if you want less marriage fraud, then you just have to make more visas available and give people ways to legitimize their status that go beyond just, are you married?
Well, I'm going to quote friend of the show, Andrew Free, who hasn't been on for a while. Always having him on is really smart because he's smart. He tweeted, the question was, why do they put so many resources into investigating marriages? And his reply was, because that is a key fulcrum for the capacity of non-white people to migrate easily. Cutting off or obstructing it is a part of the larger demographic preservation objective. And I think that's smart. And I think that's true because I have never had an issue with white clients being accused of marriage fraud. And I do have white clients. Europe, Canada, that's never been an accusation. It's never even been a consideration. And I've had many of my African clients from the Middle East, especially, accused of marriage fraud. I'm working on this one where I think we're finally going to get through it, where the first marriage was an annulment. He admittedly at the time was drinking a lot and he wasn't a very good husband, and he ended up leaving the home, and they had a visa petition filed and they just never went to the interview. She actually, his then wife, got an annulment. And so no interview, never an interview. And then years later, they look back at it and said, well, that must have been fraudulent. And then he was in a marriage for 5 or 6 years that ended up in kind of a bitter divorce with a lot of like court stuff going on about property. They were fighting over property and all that, which is usually pretty indicative of the marriage was not a fake marriage. And so this man suffered from tremendous PTSD from very horrific torture that he had suffered in his country. and he had some addiction issues and all that. So he's not the best person at testifying. So he got some stuff wrong. And again, like these marriage interviews, lots of times they're like, man, they're just like pop quizzes, right? Like, when was your first date? What was your first date? Where did you go to eat last Thursday night? It can be, petty sometimes. So they found that marriage. And now he's involved in another marriage where he has 2 children with this woman doing really well. And so they're holding these past too. And it's been a fight to get it, but it looks like we're almost there. But certainly if this guy is from North Africa, I just have this sneaking suspicion if he was from the UK and a white dude from the UK, I should say, we wouldn't be having this discussion.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And so, let's talk about another obstacle that is being put on brown immigrants under the guise of being a door, right? Entry point.
Right.
Something positive, which is really something at the end negative. And that is for our Venezuelan friends from down south.
I think it's worth starting with the United for Ukraine program, which was launched several months ago following the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, we announced TPS for Ukraine, but then they came up with this program, which is almost, I was thinking about it today. I haven't actually been asked to help with any United for Ukraine cases because I think they're so easy that a lot of people have been able to do them on their own. There are people who hire lawyers, obviously, but basically you fill out a pretty simple form online saying, hey, I know this Ukrainian person. Here's their information. Here's my information. I'm willing to give them a place to stay to help support them in the United States. There aren't these sort of overwhelming documentary requirements like there are with family-based cases, like the marriage cases you're talking about, where you're required to file 3 years of tax returns, W-2s, current pay stubs. They don't have those requirements. It's pretty basic. And tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been able to come and stay with friends or family through this program. It's been highly effective. It's very efficient. I've heard cases of United for Ukraine applications being approved in less than 24 hours. And so it's a shining example of what we're capable of. It's a little, I'll be honest, like it kind of sucks to know that this is possible. Like it's good and it's bad because when you're sitting there looking at a work permit application that's been pending for a year and a half, and immigration is telling you, sorry, there's nothing we can do. It's with an officer. It's being reviewed. And then, we shouldn't pit immigrants against each other. We're all on the same team, solidarity and whatnot. But it does kind of suck to see that actually we are capable of processing huge numbers of cases in a quick and efficient way. We just choose not to. But anyhow.
But so with the Ukrainian process, if say Ukrainian happens to make it to the United States on the southern border, are they allowed in, or does this process mean that they're sent back?
Well, I don't think that United for Ukraine was ever coupled with an expansion of Title 42, which gets us to the Venezuelan case. Now, they announced a sort of similar program for Venezuelans. Basically, it allows Venezuelans to, instead of flying to Mexico, coming up through the border, to apply, receive their permit, just like the Ukrainians, and to fly into the United States directly. And that's great, right? And actually, that seems like a good way to speed up processing, to relieve some of that pressure that is on the southern border. So that story by itself was, when I first saw that announcement, I thought, wow, that's great. We can take this United for Ukraine model and we could expand it to other places that are going through crises, right? But that's not where the story ended, unfortunately.
Right. So one thing, why this became important or something that the administration thought they had to do was there's a lot of political strife in Venezuela. It's been going on for years, if not decades, and it's been getting really bad. in the last couple of years. I think COVID really exacerbated a lot of the political strife, a lot of the violence and terrible conditions, lack of resources, food, everything, supplies for the populace. So we've been seeing more Venezuelans come into the southern border. And if you travel around South America, you'll see Venezuelans all over the place. They're all over Peru. And funny, when I go to Peru, you hear the same thing about Venezuelans from Peruvians that you'll hear about immigrants here. Oh, they're here, they're causing crime and all that,
Yeah.
and we have to deport them. So the Venezuelans are trying to get out of their country. And
Some of the first immigrants I met were in Spain in 2002. So people who'd gone to Spain who were undocumented there essentially because of the situation. So yeah, it is something that's been going on for a while.
Right. And I used to work in Miami, and a lot of my clients were Venezuelans, a lot of asylum seekers. The difference between then and now was those were mostly probably upper class individuals who could get visas to come to the United States and who could actually afford to get on an airplane and fly to Miami. Not that they were being persecuted and they had some horrible tales and a lot of bad things happened to them. They definitely deserve protection. What's happening now is you have the lower class, lack of a better term, poorer people that tend to be a little darker coming now, and they're at our southern border trying to get in and getting in and claiming asylum. Many of them have very, very legitimate asylum claims that would get granted. So the administration decided, hey, we have to do something. And they decided to come up with this program like Unite Ukraine. They just says it says process for Venezuelans. That's the catchphrase they came up with. And one of the requirements, and this might sound like trivial to some people, is they have to have a valid passport. Now, a lot of these people that were seeking help are in Mexico waiting to get in, and they've traveled days, weeks, months, and they don't have a valid passport, maybe because they weren't able to get a passport to begin with, maybe because they were being persecuted. So they don't qualify. Unaccompanied children don't qualify. If they've been ordered removed from the United States within the past 5 years, they don't qualify. If they have crossed irregularly into the United States between ports of entry after April 19th in 2022, recently, or they have crossed into Mexico or Panama after October 19th, 2022, they don't qualify. So it's really
okay. So you're going to nitpick. You're going to say it's not perfect, that there's some problems, and fine. Fair enough. It's not perfect, but it's still pretty good, right?
It's not good. I mean, it's good for the people that can get here, but it's very few.
Well,
and what we're doing is,
I was being facetious.
Oh, well, I was just annoyed. And
the real problem is what we haven't talked about yet.
What's that?
Because the program by itself has limitations.
Right.
Okay, fine. But we're still letting people in a way that's new, that's creative, that's, efficient. And that's objectively good, even if there's limitations. But what the administration did was they coupled it with an expansion of Title 42 at the southern border. They've called this a carrot and stick approach. Now, if you want to call this new program a carrot, okay, but the stick implies that you're using it to beat people, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we don't have a stick policy for people fleeing persecution. And so the expansion of Title 42, what that means is basically they're saying, we've got this wonderful program. You can just apply to fly here from your country. And if you show up at the southern border, then obviously you've decided not to do this wonderful new thing that we've offered you. And so we're going to use our stick and implement Title 42, which basically means you're not allowed to request asylum. It doesn't matter if you've been literally threatened and tortured by the Maduro government. If you're under threat of being persecuted, it doesn't matter. You're just going to get returned automatically to Mexico. You have no right to request asylum at the southern border. And on top of that, these migrants are being returned to Mexico and given forms from the Mexican government basically saying you've got to leave Mexico now within 7 days. And on top of all of that, it'd be one thing if like you got kicked back to Mexico and all of Mexico was just Puerto Vallarta. Like then I wouldn't feel all that bad about it, right? Like, okay, well, maybe I'd be moving there too. But according to our own State Department, migrants are specifically targeted in these circumstances by cartels, by the Mexican government itself. There are documented stories of Mexican police, Mexican military targeting these kinds of migrants from Cuba, Venezuela, wherever, and holding them ransom, kidnapping them, torturing them. And we know that happens because it's in our own State Department report. So it's not some, liberal talking point or whatever. It's according to the State Department. This whole thing, it started out with a pretty nice little story, turns out to be a total disaster.
And so more using Title 42. So Biden, when he was running, he said, he's going to get rid of Title 42. They tried, right? And it's being held up in court. And so they're not able to fully get rid of it. But there's nothing that the court has ruled saying that they have to expand it. So they don't have to, like, they're not, people who defend Biden will often say, well, look what the courts are doing. He's being thwarted and all this. No, he's not being thwarted here. He's making the conscious determination to expel or not even let in these people who are seeking asylum. And sometimes you'll hear the right, they'll scoff at, oh, asylum seekers, like it's not real, like the magic words we hear, they just have to say these magic words. But I've dealt with a lot of people from Venezuela. I have clients who are now from Venezuela who've come over recently. And these are legitimate claims. People from Venezuela and Nicaragua is not included, but they're coming from similar situations. They have legitimate claims. And I know this is going to hurt the feelings of some of our listeners who are on the left, like I think we are, but the Maduro government, they're fucking fascist. Just stop it. They're not, just because they say they're socialists and they engage in fascism. They persecute people. They're a terrible, terrible, repressive government that is hurting their people. And just because they fly a flag of socialism, I would hope that people on the left can see through that they only use socialism, them in countries like them in Nicaragua, to repress people and persecute people. And socialism can be used for so much better things. But one would think that of all countries, that we would be the country that would say, you know what, we're gonna stop this. We're gonna help these people out. And what we're doing is inhumane. If Trump did the same thing, people would be on the rooftops screaming about it and all that. And now with Trump, he would do the same thing. Of course, he wouldn't have the carrot. Of course, we know that. But that is such a small percentage of the people who need to be helped. So
right.
It is discouraging. And, we're coming up to an election, midterm election, and I just cannot help but be discouraged.
Yeah, it's so frustrating because, you can get into deep left theoretical talk about open borders and, a utopian world where there's no countries anymore. And it's easy for people to scoff at that because it sounds so far away from where we are. At this point, all we're really asking for is to just enforce the laws that exist. Like, allow people at the border to request asylum. Like, that's in the law. It's what Obama did for 8 years. It's not crazy leftist fantasy land. It's really basic stuff. And
also, when we look at something, a country like Venezuela, right? Don't you think that's something that we could have come to an agreement on, right? When the right says, all these terrible communists, and of course they refer to them as communists, Maduro and these communist dictators there in Venezuela and Cuba, and they're horrible, and we have to do whatever we can to fight against that. But that when the rubber hits the road, they don't want to do anything to help these people.
Right.
And you think that would be something like we could kind of come to an agreement on, even if we wanted to bite our tongue and say, okay, we're going to help the Venezuelans, but the Guatemalans and Hondurans and all those things, right? But we got to everybody, and why? It's just really frustrating. And
in the old days, there was that sort of like, we're going to help the Cubans for sort of political reasons. And a lot of the Cubans that were coming over were quite conservative. And I think the same is probably true about the Venezuelans coming over. A lot of them probably, they're not crazy leftists. A lot of them are probably fairly conservative. And for a long time, we made that calculation with the Cubans, and it was totally unfair and unjustified probably to single them out. But there was that sort of political calculus, and we've stopped doing that. We've just decided to be to everyone, which I guess is at least less hypocritical. Like if we're going to be, fair about it. But
again, now we have an election, right? And as a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. We are now again put in the position where, do we continue to vote blue, right, or not? Because we know Republicans are worse, right?
Yeah.
And we have the conversation, they're worse, so we should vote for the less worse there. But the gap between the worse, it's slowly or maybe rapidly shrinking.
Yeah. I think the gap is still there. I still think the Republicans are the primary obstacle between things like the DREAM Act. And like you said, with the Republicans, there's no carrot. Not that the carrot here is so great, but I still think, and voting is such a small thing, and a protest vote is, it's not even a protest. So to me, I'm still vote blue no matter who, personally. And I think there's lots of other benefits.
It kind of provoked a question I've had for some time now, and maybe if we have anyone listening from the UK, they could chime in on this. But why is Britain the only country that seems to have to remind people to mind the gap when they're getting off the subway? Like there's that little space in there.
We talked about it.
They make a big deal of that.
We talked about
why? I've been to France. I've been to Germany. They don't say mind the gap. What is it about the Brits?
Maybe they got a bigger gap. I don't know. I've never been there. So my message would be to still vote for Democrats, but that if you think that that's where the work stops, it obviously doesn't. So the real activists are the ones getting the work done and making progress. And if we think that we can just do it in the ballot box, it's obviously not going to happen. So anyways, that's my uplifting sign off for the day.
Well, Stephen, like always,
don't get coronavirus. It's not good.
No, don't do that. That's good. Good advice. Just filled with wisdom.